The helicopter came in low over the bay, running lights cutting through the rain like something wounded trying to find the ground. Maya Reeves heard it before she saw it. That particular frequency of rotor wash that vibrated in the chest cavity rather than the ears, a sound that belonged to urgency rather than routine. She was standing at the nurses' station on the 4th floor ICU, reviewing a post-op chart, and she paused without knowing why. Just paused, looked up, listened. The other nurses didn't look up. She noted that too. The call came through the intercom 40 seconds later. Incoming trauma, VIP status, full escort, clear bay 4. The charge nurse, Patricia Holloway, straightened her spine in a way that had nothing to do with posture and everything to do with rank. "Admiral," she said quietly, to no one in particular. "What, James Kellerman?" She said the name the way people say the names of monuments, as though the syllables themselves required a certain reverence. Maya had heard the name. Everyone at Naval Medical Center San Diego had heard the name. Kellerman was the kind of officer whose biography preceded him into every room he entered. 31 years of service, 2 combat deployments in the early SEAL years before command took him off the water, a chest full of decorations that read like a catalogue of American military engagement over the last 3 decades. He had testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee twice. His photograph hung in the lobby of the Naval Special Warfare Command building in Coronado. He was, by every institutional measure, a man who had earned the right to be treated as though the normal rules of gravity applied to him differently. The trauma team was already moving when the elevator opened. Maya fell into the flow of it. Not because she was assigned to Bay 4, not because anyone had called her specifically, but because that was how she moved through a hospital. She positioned herself where information was densest. She watched. They brought him in on a backboard, cervical collar in place, left leg splinted from mid-thigh to ankle, the kind of compound fracture that announced itself even through the stabilizing foam. His dress uniform had been cut away. She could see the remnants of gold braid at the collar, the flash of a ribbon rack reduced to fragments. His face was abraded on the left side, the kind of road rash that came from impact with an unforgiving surface at speed. His eyes were closed. He was breathing on his own. That was the first thing she noted. Dr. Sarah Chen was already at the bedside, moving through the primary survey with the efficient confidence of someone who understood that her performance in this room would be remembered. Pupils. She checked them with her pen light, called out the response. GCS assessment. Vitals read aloud by the trauma nurse. The attending radiologist was on his way up. The neurology consult had been paged. Maya stood at the foot of the bed and watched Kellerman's face. His breathing was regular. Not the irregular, labored pattern of someone with significant intracranial pressure. Not the Cheney-Stokes rhythm that sometimes accompanied severe brain injury. Regular, almost. And she filed this word away carefully, the way she filed things that she wasn't yet ready to name, almost controlled. Severe head trauma, Chen was saying. Not to Maya, not to anyone in particular, but to the room. Fractured ribs, 3 and 4 on the right. Tib-fib fracture, left leg, already splinted in the field. Lacerations, superficial. The head trauma is our primary concern. She looked at the monitor. BP is stable. That's good. That's very good. Maya looked at the monitor too. The blood pressure was stable. For a man who had reportedly been in a helicopter that went down hard into a training range in the hills east of Coronado, whose aircraft had reportedly rolled twice before coming to rest against a concrete drainage barrier, whose crew had reportedly included 4 other personnel, 3 of whom had not survived the night, the blood pressure was remarkably, almost philosophically, stable. She said nothing. The neurology consult arrived. Dr. Marcus Webb, 50-ish, careful, the kind of physician who chose his words the way a watchmaker chose his tools. He ran his own assessment. Sternal rub, no response. Nail bed pressure, no response. He shone his light into Kellerman's pupils again, called out the response, and Maya watched from her position at the foot of the bed and saw something that Webb, who was looking at his clipboard when it happened, did not see. The left pupil contracted a fraction of a second before the light reached it. It was nothing. It was the kind of thing that could be explained by ambient light shift, by the movement of personnel in the room, by a dozen unremarkable physiological variables. It was the kind of thing that a nurse with 2 years of ICU experience would not have caught, would not have known to look for, would not have understood the significance of even if she had seen it. Maya had been watching people's eyes for longer than her current employment record suggested. She wrote nothing in the chart. She was not yet assigned to this patient. She had no standing to write anything. She simply watched and remembered and said nothing. The room eventually quieted to the particular hush that settles around a patient who is unconscious and stable. That strange combination of urgency and waiting that defined the ICU at its most fundamental. The trauma team filtered out. Webb gave his preliminary assessment: significant concussive injury, possible subdural involvement pending imaging, medically induced rest appropriate, prognosis cautiously optimistic given the vital signs. He would return in the morning. Chen assigned the Admiral to Bay 4, night shift, continuous monitoring. She looked around the room and her eyes landed on Maya with the particular expression of someone who had not specifically chosen a resource, but was willing to use it. "Reeves, you're on him tonight." "Yes, Doctor." Chen paused. There was something in Maya's tone, not insubordination, not warmth, not the reflexive eagerness that Chen was accustomed to from her night nurses. Just acknowledgement, flat and complete. Chen looked at her for a moment longer than necessary, then left. Maya pulled a chair to the bedside, not close. Far enough that she was outside the immediate visual field of a man lying supine, close enough that she could see his face, his hands, the monitor, and the door simultaneously. She settled into it with the ease of someone who had spent a great deal of time waiting in positions that required stillness. The rain had intensified outside. She could hear it against the high windows, that particular percussion of a Pacific storm coming in off the water, the kind of rain that didn't apologize for itself. The ICU at 2 a.m. had its own acoustics. The soft, rhythmic confirmation of monitors, the distant murmur of the nurse's station, the occasional footstep in the corridor. She knew all of it. She had catalogued it on her first night in this unit the way she catalogued everything: exits, sightlines, variables, baselines. Kellerman lay still. She watched his chest rise and fall. She watched his hands, both of them resting at his sides, the left one slightly supinated, the right one palm down against the sheet. She watched the small muscles around his eyes, the ones that most people didn't know they were using, the ones that were almost impossible to fully control when the brain was engaged and alert and listening. At 2:47 in the morning, a junior officer knocked softly on the bay door and leaned in. "Lieutenant Commander something." She caught the insignia, didn't catch the name. He looked at Kellerman with an expression that contained grief and relief in roughly equal measure, and he said, very quietly, "Sir, we're going to get through this, sir." Then he left. For approximately 4 seconds after the door closed, the muscles around Kellerman's right eye tightened. It was not a response to pain. It was not a neurological artifact. It was the expression of a man who had just heard something that required a response, and who had chosen, with effort, not to give one. Maya looked at her chart. She made a note about the time. She wrote, "Observed possible micro-expression response to auditory stimulus, 0247. Pupillary response inconsistency noted during initial assessment, 2134. Will continue monitoring." She dated it. She signed it. She clipped it to the inside of the chart where it would be seen during morning rounds. Then she settled back into her chair and looked at the Admiral's face and thought about the 23 sailors who had not been brought to this hospital tonight, the ones who had gone somewhere else entirely, the ones whose families were being visited right now by officers in dress uniforms, standing on front porches in the rain, holding their covers in their hands. She thought about what it meant to survive something that killed the people around you. She thought about what it meant to choose silence. Outside, the rain kept coming. Inside, the monitors kept their steady count. And Admiral James Kellerman lay in his bed and breathed with the careful, measured regularity of a man who was very much awake. Maya Reeves watched him and said nothing. For now. The night shift at Naval Medical Center San Diego had its own particular silence. Not the silence of absence. The building was never truly quiet, never fully still. But the silence of held breath, of monitors speaking in low electronic tones, of the specific hush that settles over a ward when the visitors have gone home and the patients are left alone with whoever they actually are. Maya Reeves had always preferred this hour. She stood at the nursing station at 0200. The overhead fluorescents dimmed to their nighttime setting, and reviewed the chart for the third time in 4 hours. Not because she had forgotten what it said, because she was looking for the space between what it said and what she knew. Admiral James Kellerman, 58 years old, admitted 71 hours ago following blunt force trauma to the cranium. 3 fractured ribs on the left side, a compound fracture of the right tibia, and a laceration above the left orbital ridge that had required 11 sutures. The helicopter had gone down hard. By any reasonable measure, but the man in room 7 should have been in significantly worse condition than he was. That was the first thing that had snagged her attention, the way a loose thread snags a careful hand. Not dramatically, not with any fanfare, just a small resistance that said, "Look here." She closed the chart and walked the corridor. The ward was arranged in a horseshoe around the central station, 6 rooms on each arm, with the most critical patients housed in the inner curve, where the monitors could be watched from multiple angles simultaneously. Room 7 was the second door on the left. Through the narrow window in the door, she could see the shape of him in the bed, large even in stillness, silver-haired, the kind of physical presence that didn't diminish with unconsciousness. The machines beside him kept their quiet vigil, the pulse oximeter, the cardiac monitor, the blood pressure cuff on its automated cycle, all of them speaking in numbers and all of the numbers saying, "This man is doing remarkably well." That was the second thing. She pushed open the door with her shoulder, carrying the small tray of routine supplies. Fresh gauze, the pen light, the clipboard. She moved without announcement, without the small social noise most people make when entering a room, the throat clearing and the soft greeting. She simply entered, the way she always entered, and she watched. Kellerman lay on his back, arms at his sides, eyes closed. His breathing was slow and even. His color was good, better than good actually, which was itself a data point worth noting. 71 hours after a traumatic brain injury of the documented severity, patients did not typically have this color. They were pale or mottled, or carrying the specific grey cast of a body redirecting its resources inward. Kellerman looked like a man who was sleeping off a long flight. Maya set the tray down on the bedside table without sound. She uncapped the pen light. The pupillary light reflex test was standard, routine. She performed it on every patient in her care at every check, and she had performed it on Kellerman 6 times in the past 3 days. What she was looking for was not the reflex itself. Both pupils had been consistently reactive, which was itself notable given the reported severity of the cranial impact, but the timing, the speed of constriction, the symmetry, and the one variable that no one else seemed to be tracking. What happened in the half-second before the light arrived? She leaned in, brought the pen light to within 4 inches of his right eye, and in the fraction of a moment before she clicked it on, she watched his eyelid. It was almost nothing. Attention. a microcontraction of the orbicularis oculi, the muscle that closes the eye, that preceded the light stimulus by perhaps a quarter of a second. Not a response to the light, a preparation for it. She clicked the light on. The pupil constricted normally. She moved to the left eye. Same result. She straightened up, capped the pen light, and stood very still for a moment, looking at his face. A man in a genuine coma does not prepare for the light. He cannot. The preparation requires awareness of the incoming stimulus, which requires consciousness, which requires a brain that is present and attending to its environment. The reflex itself could be unconscious. The preparation could not. She had seen it twice before tonight. She had documented it both times in her nursing notes, in the careful, neutral language of clinical observation. Possible pre-stimulus lid tension noted prior to pupillary assessment, right eye. Recommend neurology review. The notes were in the chart. Dr. Chen had initialed them without comment. Maya picked up the clipboard and wrote the time. She wrote the vitals from the monitors. She wrote, again, in the same careful, neutral language. Pre-stimulus lid tension observed bilaterally during routine pupillary assessment, 0 to 14 hours. Response pattern inconsistent with GCS score of 6. Third documented instance. Recommend formal neurological re-evaluation. She set the clipboard down and looked at him for a long moment. He was still, perfectly still, the kind of stillness that takes practice. She had known men who could do this, who had trained their bodies to perform stillness the way other people performed action, with intention, with discipline, with the understanding that sometimes the most powerful thing a body could do was nothing at all. She had known men who could slow their breathing on command, who could regulate their heart rate through pure will, who could lie in a hide for 18 hours without a tremor. She had known what that kind of training looked like from the inside. She did not think about where she had learned that. She rarely did, anymore. What she thought about was the cardiac monitor. She turned to it now, studying the waveform with the same focused attention she had given his face. The rhythm was sinus regular, rate of 54 beats per minute. 54 was low for a hospitalized trauma patient. Most patients in acute recovery ran higher. The body's stress response kept the rate elevated, the sympathetic nervous system doing its anxious arithmetic. 54 suggested either exceptional cardiovascular conditioning or a deliberate suppression of the stress response. In a genuine coma patient, you would not expect the latter. In a man with exceptional cardiovascular conditioning, you would not be surprised by the former. She cross-referenced his admission blood work in her memory. Troponin levels had been normal. No cardiac event. No arrhythmia on the initial EKG. The low resting rate had been noted and attributed to his physical fitness. The chart had a flag from the admitting physician that read athlete's heart, likely baseline. And no one had looked at it again. Maya looked at it again. She pulled the rolling stool from the corner and sat down, not because she was tired, but because sitting changed the angle of observation. And she had learned a long time ago that changing your angle was sometimes the only way to see what you had been missing. From this position, slightly lower, she could see the underside of his jaw, the tendons of his neck, the specific architecture of a face that was working very hard to do nothing. The jaw was the tell. It was almost always the jaw. The masseter muscle, the one that clenched the teeth, was one of the hardest muscles in the human body to fully relax under stress. Most people couldn't do it. Most people, even when they were trying to appear unconscious, carried a residual tension in the jaw that spoke of effort, way of the energy required to maintain the performance. Kellerman's jaw was relaxed, genuinely, impressively relaxed, but his left hand was not. She had not noticed it before because it was subtle, and because the hand was partially beneath the sheet, and because she had been focused on the face. But now, from this angle, she could see the fingers of his left hand against the mattress. They were not curled in the loose, slightly open position of unconscious relaxation. They were flat, pressed, the hand of a man who was holding himself in place. Maya stood up. She made no sound. She replaced the stool in the corner, gathered her tray, and walked to the door. At the threshold, she paused, not turning, not looking back, just pausing, and she said quietly to the room, "Vitals look good, Admiral. It's sleep well." She said it the way she said it to every patient. Routine, neutral, a small professional courtesy extended to someone who could not hear it. She felt the room change behind her, not dramatically, not with any sound or movement she could have pointed to in a court of law. Just a shift in the quality of the air, the way a room changes when someone in it becomes suddenly, acutely alert, the way a room changes when it is no longer empty of attention. She walked back to the nursing station and sat down and opened her documentation software and began to type. She typed everything she had observed in order, with timestamps, in the precise and unremarkable language of clinical nursing notes. She typed it the way she had been trained to document things, not with interpretation, not with accusation, but with the specific gravity of a person who understood that the record was the record, and that the record, once made, was very difficult to unmake. When she was finished, she sent a copy to Dr. Chen's secure message queue. She sent a second copy to the charge nurse, and then, because she was thorough, because thoroughness was the thing she had never been able to stop being, she saved a third copy to her personal encrypted drive. Outside the window, at the end of the corridor, the Pacific was invisible in the dark, but she could hear it. The low, persistent sound of water that did not stop, that had never stopped, that would be there long after every admiral and every cover story and every carefully maintained silence had dissolved into whatever they were actually made of. She pulled the next chart and kept working. The chart had been updated 3 times in the last 18 hours, and every update said the same thing in different language. Stable, improving, consistent with expected recovery trajectory. Maya stood at the nurse's station at 0340 and read it again, the way she had read it the first time. Not for what it said, but for what it didn't. The attending physician's notes were clean. Too clean. Dr. Chen wrote in the precise, uncluttered shorthand of someone who had decided on a conclusion and was now building the documentation around it. Every observation confirmed the narrative. Every data point supported the arc. Admiral James Kellerman, decorated SEAL commander, survivor of 23 men's deaths, was healing on schedule. The brain was recovering. The body was cooperating. The story was intact. Maya set the chart down and looked through the glass partition at room 7. He was still. The way he had been still every night she'd worked this week. The kind of stillness that looked, at first glance, like unconsciousness, at second glance like sleep, at third glance, and Maya had given it many third glances, like something else entirely, like a man who had learned, somewhere in his life, how to be absolutely motionless when he needed to be, how to slow his breathing to the edge of imperceptibility, how to make his face a surface with nothing behind it. She had seen that before. She couldn't have said where. She didn't try. She pulled on a fresh pair of gloves and walked to his room. The night shift had its own quality of silence. The day staff moved through the ICU with the energy of performance, the awareness of being observed, of supervisors and families, and the ambient theatre of a hospital in full operation. At night, the performance ended. What remained was the actual work, and the actual work was quieter and more honest than anything that happened in daylight. Maya preferred it. She had always preferred environments where the noise had been stripped away and what remained was signal. She checked his IV line first, then the monitors. Then she moved to his left side and lifted his eyelid with 2 fingers, directing her pen light at the pupil. The left pupil contracted. Normal response, she moved to the right. The right pupil contracted, then, for just under a half second, dilated again before settling. It was a small thing, the kind of thing that didn't make it into a chart note, unless you were looking for it. Unless you had done this enough times to know that pupils didn't behave that way in genuine unconsciousness. They responded to light. They held. They didn't reconsider. She made a note in her personal log, not the official chart. Her own notebook, small and black, that she kept in the left breast pocket of her scrubs. She'd been keeping it since her second night on his case. The handwriting was small and economical, the kind of handwriting that had been trained into efficiency rather than grown into it naturally. She moved to his right hand and pressed 2 fingers against the nail bed. A sternal rub was the standard pain response test for unresponsive patients, but she had already done that twice and documented the results. This was different, and this was lighter. A pressure that a genuinely unconscious patient would not register, but that a conscious one who was very, very good at this, might, in a moment of imperfect control, respond to. His ring finger moved. It was less than a centimeter. It was the kind of movement that could be attributed to involuntary muscle response, to the random firing of a nervous system in recovery, to any number of things that had nothing to do with conscious volition. She knew that. She also knew what involuntary muscle response looked like, and it didn't look like a single finger moving in precise, contained isolation while the rest of the hand remained perfectly still. She wrote it down. Behind her, the door opened. Petty Officer Daniels, the night tech, came in to check the fluid levels. He was 22 and earnest and slightly afraid of Maya in the way that some of the younger staff were, not because she was unkind, but because she moved through the ward with a certainty that made people feel they might be missing something she could see. "Anything?" he asked. "No change," Maya said. Her voice was level. She capped her pen. Daniels looked at the Admiral with the expression that most of the staff wore around him, a kind of reverent discomfort, the awareness of proximity to someone whose name appeared in briefings and commendations, and the kind of news coverage that used words like decorated and legendary and hero of the naval special warfare community. 23 men had died on his operation. The official language around that fact was careful and gravitational, the language of tragedy rather than accountability. A mechanical failure, catastrophic and unforeseen. The Admiral himself had nearly perished. "My uncle served," Daniels said, "not to anyone in particular. He says guys like this, they come back, like they're built different." Maya didn't respond. She was looking at the monitor readout, at the subtle, almost imperceptible elevation in Kellerman's heart rate that had appeared in the 30 seconds since Daniels entered the room. It was 4 beats per minute above his baseline. It was nothing. It was everything. She walked back to the nurse's station and opened the crash report on her tablet. She had requested it through official channels 2 days ago, citing the need to understand the mechanism of injury for accurate neurological assessment. It was a legitimate clinical reason. Doctor. Chen had approved it without reading the request carefully, which was the outcome Maya had anticipated. The report was 47 pages of sanitized language and careful omission. She had read it 4 times. She was reading it again now, but she was reading a different part. The timeline. The specific sequence of decisions in the 40 minutes before the insertion went wrong. There was a gap. 11 minutes between the last recorded communication from the mission commander and the first distress signal. In 11 minutes, a great deal could happen. In 11 minutes, a decision could be made, implemented, and begin its catastrophic consequences. The report did not account for those 11 minutes. It moved past them with the smooth efficiency of a document that had been written to move past them. She cross-referenced the injury report. Kellerman's injuries were consistent with the crash. Fractured ribs, shattered left tibia, severe contusion to the temporal lobe. All of it real, all of it documented. None of it she had come to understand, requiring the depth of unconsciousness he was presenting. A man with his injuries, a man with his physiological profile, his documented fitness level, the dense musculature of someone who had spent decades in special operations training, should have been showing intermittent consciousness by now, should have been surfacing. The brain didn't hide that long from injuries of this severity, unless the injuries were worse than documented, or unless the brain had reasons of its own. She thought about that, about reasons. She thought about 23 families. She was still thinking about it when Dr. Chen arrived for early rounds at 06:30, earlier than usual, with the slightly elevated energy of someone who had received good news, or was expecting to. She reviewed the chart at the nurse's station without sitting down, the tablet held at the angle of someone performing efficiency. He had a strong night, Chen said. It wasn't a question. His pupillary responses showed some irregularity around 0350, Maya said. Right eye post-stimulus dilation. I documented it. Chen scrolled, found the note. Her expression didn't change, but something behind it did. A small recalibration, the adjustment of someone who had not expected to find a complication and was now deciding how to categorize it. Consistent with recovery phase neurological fluctuation, she said. Not unusual. I've seen it 3 times now, Maya said. Same eye, same post-stimulus pattern. It's consistent. Consistently within normal parameters, Chen said. She set the tablet down. She looked at Maya with the particular expression of a senior physician addressing a junior nurse who has mistaken attentiveness for expertise. Not unkind exactly, but precise in its hierarchy. Maya, he's an admiral. He's been through a catastrophic trauma. His recovery is being monitored by the best neurological team in this facility. What you're describing is vigilance, and vigilance is good, but vigilance isn't diagnosis. Maya said nothing. She had learned, in some earlier chapter of her life, that silence was not the same as agreement, and that the people who needed to believe it was agreement would always choose to believe it. Chen left, and Maya watched her go. She opened her notebook. She wrote the time. She wrote the date. She wrote, right pupil, third occurrence, 0350. Finger movement, right hand, isolated, 0312. HR elevation, 4 beats per minute above baseline, correlated with new presence in room. She looked at what she had written. Then she looked through the glass at room 7, at the still and silver-haired figure in the bed, at the man who had decided that a hospital was a better place to hide than anywhere else he could think of. She closed the notebook and put it back in her pocket. She had more questions than she'd had yesterday. That was the direction things were moving. She didn't know yet exactly where they were going, but she had spent enough time reading terrain to recognize when the ground beneath her story was less solid than it appeared. She went back to work. He woke up on a Tuesday. That was how the staff would remember it afterward. Not the hour, not the clinical details, but the day, Tuesday, as though the Admiral had consulted a calendar and selected the most appropriate moment for a miracle. Maya was not in the room when it happened. She had been reassigned to the supply corridor 2 hours earlier on a pretext so thin it barely held its own weight, a medication reconciliation task that any orderly could have handled, that should have been handled by an orderly, that existed for no other reason than to move her body away from room 14. She understood this. She completed the task without comment, initialed the clipboard, and returned the clipboard to its hook with the same deliberate economy of motion she brought to everything. Then she stood at the corridor window and watched the rain move across the flight deck in grey curtains and waited. She did not have to wait long. The sound travelled before the news did, a kind of collective exhale from the ICU wing, a shift in the atmospheric pressure of the floor, the way a building changes when something significant has occurred inside it. She had felt that change before, in other buildings, in other contexts she did not think about here. and her body recognized it before her mind had processed the cause. Her shoulders dropped a precise half-inch. Her breathing slowed. She turned from the window. Dr. Chen was already moving down the corridor toward her, and the expression on Chen's face was the expression of someone who has just been proven correct about something they were never actually uncertain about. He's awake, Chen said. There was a brightness in it, a proprietary satisfaction. Responsive, oriented, asking for water. It's remarkable. Maya said, Yes. Chen paused, reading something in that single syllable that she couldn't quite name. His family's with him. His wife flew in this morning. His son. She paused again. He's asking to see the care team. Of course he is, Maya said, and she said it so quietly and so evenly that Chen couldn't tell whether it was agreement or something else entirely. She followed Chen back to the wing. The room had rearranged itself around him. That was the only way to describe it. Admiral James Kellerman was sitting up. Not fully, not dramatically, but enough. Propped against the raised bed with the particular posture of a man who has spent decades being the fixed point around which other people orient themselves. His color was better than it should have been for someone emerging from 5 days of unconsciousness. His eyes were clear. His wife, a composed woman in her late 50s, with the practiced stillness of someone who had spent a career waiting for bad news that never quite arrived, sat at his left side with her hand over his. His son stood at the foot of the bed in his navy whites, and the expression on the young man's face was the specific, uncomplicated relief of someone who has not yet learned to question the things he loves. Kellerman's gaze moved across the assembled staff with the systematic efficiency of a man taking inventory. It paused on Maya. She had positioned herself at the outer edge of the room near the monitoring station, where she had a clear sight line to the bed and to the door simultaneously. She was not aware of having chosen this position. She was simply in it. His eyes held hers for 2 seconds. Then he looked away. "Water," he said, and his voice was rough in the way that voices are rough after intubation, after disuse, after performance. One of the other nurses moved immediately. Maya watched the way his hand accepted the cup, the grip, the control, the absence of the fine tremor that should have been present in a man whose motor cortex had genuinely been under siege for 5 days. The cup did not shake, not even slightly. She wrote this down, not on the official chart. In the small notebook she kept in the left breast pocket of her scrubs, and the one the other nurses assumed was for personal reminders, grocery lists, the ordinary debris of a civilian life. She wrote, "Grip strength, no tremor, day 5. Dr. Chen was speaking. Something warm and clinical about recovery trajectories, about the body's resilience, about the remarkable nature of his return. Kellerman listened with the patience of a man who has sat through many briefings and learned to appear attentive while thinking about something else. His wife squeezed his hand. His son said, "Dad," in a voice that contained everything a son can feel when he believes he has almost lost his father, and Kellerman turned to him with an expression that was, Maya had to admit, genuinely tender. She did not let that soften anything. She moved to the monitoring station and began pulling his overnight vitals, even cross-referencing them against the neurological baseline they had established on admission. There was a specific pattern she'd been tracking, a pattern in his REM cycles, in the micro-fluctuations of his blood pressure during the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning, when the floor was quietest and the likelihood of observation was lowest. The pattern did not look like a man fighting his way back from traumatic brain injury. It looked like a man sleeping. Deeply, restoratively, deliberately sleeping. She was still looking at the readout when she became aware that the room had gone quiet in a particular way. She looked up. Kellerman was watching her again. This time he did not look away. "You," he said. The word landed in the room like a stone into still water. Dr. Chen turned. The wife looked up. The son straightened. Maya closed the chart. She turned to face him fully, her hands at her sides, her weight distributed evenly across both feet in a stance that was not aggressive and was not deferential and was not anything that a person could easily categorize. "You've been watching me," Kellerman said. His voice had found its register now, the one that had given orders in conditions she could imagine with a specificity that would have surprised him. "Since I came in." "It's my job to watch you," Maya said. "You're my patient." "That's not what I mean." The room held its breath. Chen's expression had shifted into something careful and political. The sun was looking between them with the confusion of someone watching a conversation conducted in a language he doesn't speak. "I think," Kellerman said, and he said it slowly, and with the deliberateness of a man who has learned that precision is its own form of violence, "that you have been making the staff uncomfortable, that you have been introducing doubt into a care environment that requires confidence, that you are a good nurse who lacks the judgment to know the boundaries of her role." Maya said nothing. "I'd like a different nurse," he said. He turned to Chen as he said it, which was the point. The turn itself was the point. The dismissal implicit in the redirection of his attention, the way he moved her from subject to furniture without raising his voice. Chen said, "Of course, Admiral. We'll arrange that immediately." Maya looked at Kellerman for one more moment. He had already looked away. His wife was saying something soft to him. His son had relaxed. The room had accepted the verdict and moved on, the way rooms do when the person with the most rank has spoken. She picked up her notebook from the monitoring station. She capped her pen. She walked to the door with the same measured pace she had entered with, neither hurrying nor performing slowness, and as she passed the threshold, she did something that no one in the room would have been able to explain if asked to describe it later. She glanced back at the emergency exit at the far end of the corridor. A single glance, automatic, the kind of glance that catalogues distances and obstacles without conscious instruction, the kind of glance that belongs to a specific kind of training, a specific kind of history, a specific kind of person who has learned that knowing where the exits are is not paranoia, but arithmetic. Then she was gone. Behind her, in room 14, was Admiral James Kellerman accepted another sip of water and told his son he was going to be fine. He believed in that moment that he had solved his problem. He had made a mistake that would cost him everything, and it had nothing to do with the crash, and nothing to do with the 23 sailors, and nothing to do with the classified report or the sanitized timeline or the testimony he had spent 5 days in a hospital bed arranging in his mind like furniture before a fire. It had to do with the way Maya Reeves had looked at that exit. He just didn't know it yet. The morning of the Admiral's awakening began like any other morning on the ward, the particular grey light of a San Diego winter pressing through the high windows, the smell of antiseptic and recycled air, like the low percussion of monitors keeping time for men and women who could not keep it themselves. Maya had been on shift for 6 hours. She had changed 2 dressings, recalibrated a drip, and talked a 22-year-old petty officer through a panic attack at 3 a.m. by sitting beside him in the dark and saying almost nothing at all. She was good at that. The silence that wasn't absence. The presence that didn't demand anything back. She was charting at the station outside room 7 when she heard the sound. Not an alarm, not a code, just a voice. Low and rough and carrying the specific authority of a man who had spent 4 decades being listened to. "Someone get my wife." She looked up from the screen. Through the glass partition she could see the movement, the shift in the bed, the hand reaching for the rail, more the silver head turning toward the door with the careful deliberateness of a man who knew exactly how much effort to display. Not too much, not too little. The performance of a body remembering itself. She set down her stylus. She watched him for 3 full seconds before she moved. By the time she entered the room, Dr. Chen was already there. Maya didn't know how that was possible. Chen's office was on the 2nd floor, and the notification had gone out perhaps 40 seconds ago. But there she was, standing at the foot of the bed with her tablet pressed to her chest and an expression on her face that was trying very hard not to be excitement and failing. Behind her, a corpsman was already on the phone. Through the corridor window, Maya could see the Admiral's wife, a tall woman in a grey wool coat who had been in the family waiting room since 6 a.m., being escorted toward the room by one of the floor nurses. Everything was moving very fast. Everything was moving in exactly the direction Kellerman needed it to move. Maya positioned herself at the medication cart to the left of the bed. She began checking the IV line. Her hands were steady. Her eyes were not entirely on her hands. Kellerman's performance was technically excellent. The confusion was calibrated, present enough to be convincing, brief enough not to require neurological intervention. He asked where he was. He asked about his men. His voice broke on that last word in a way that was almost perfect. And Maya watched Dr. Chen's face soften in real time, and watched the attending physician's clinical distance dissolve into something warmer and more useful to the man in the bed. He asked for water. He accepted it with a tremor in his hand that disappeared when he set the cup down. His wife came through the door, and the room contracted around the moment. She was crying before she reached him. His son, the junior officer, 26 years old, with his father's jaw and his father's posture, stood in the doorway with his cover in his hands and his eyes bright and full. It was, Maya thought, a genuinely moving scene. She did not doubt that the wife's tears were real. She did not doubt that the son's relief was real. She doubted only the man at the center of it. She finished checking the IV line. She made a note in the chart. She was preparing to step back to the cart when Kellerman's eyes found her. She had known they would. She had been waiting for it since the moment she heard his voice. She had positioned herself where she could be seen because she understood, with a certainty that lived below conscious thought, that invisibility was not an option, that trying to disappear would only sharpen his interest. So she stood where she was, and she met his gaze, and she kept her face exactly neutral. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes, a calculation, fast and cold, running beneath the warmth of the family reunion, like a current beneath still water. Then he said her name. Not her full name, just Nurse. The room didn't go quiet. It was already quiet, but the quality of the quiet changed. "Come here," he said. She walked to the bedside. She stopped at the appropriate distance, close enough to hear him clearly, far enough to maintain the professional geometry of the interaction. She held her tablet at her side. Her posture was straight, without being rigid. She had stood in front of men who outranked this man, and she had not flinched. And she did not flinch now, and she knew that this, too, was something she could not fully hide. The not flinching, the particular quality of her stillness. And she filed that knowledge away and kept her face empty. "You've been watching me," Kellerman said. His voice was still rough, still performing its recovery, but underneath it was something harder and more familiar, the voice of a man who managed threats. "Since I came in." "I'm your assigned nurse," Maya said. Observation is part of my role." "Observation," he repeated. The word came back slightly altered, slightly diminished. "Dr. Chen tells me you've been raising concerns about my condition." Maya glanced at Chen. Chen's expression had shifted into something careful and uninvested, the expression of a person who has already decided which side of a line they're standing on. "I documented some inconsistencies in the neurological assessments," Maya said. "That's standard protocol. Inconsistencies." Again the word returned smaller than she'd sent it. He had a gift for that, for making precision sound like presumption. "You're a nurse. How long have you been a nurse?" 14 months at this facility." 14 months. He let that sit. His wife had stepped back slightly. His son was still in the doorway, though watching with the expression of a young man who has learned to read his father's moods and is currently reading one he recognizes. "And in 14 months, You've developed the clinical expertise to question a senior physician's assessment of a flag officer's neurological status. I raised a question, Maya said. I didn't make a diagnosis. You made the staff uncomfortable, Kellerman said. His voice had found its full register now. Not loud, never loud, but carrying the specific weight of a man who had ordered things and had those orders carried out. You created doubt in an environment that requires confidence. You inserted your inexperience into a situation that required deference to people with more knowledge and more years and more accountability than you have. The room was completely still. Doctor. Chen was looking at her tablet. The corpsman near the door had found something to study on the wall. Kellerman's wife had her hand over her mouth. His son had taken one step into the room and stopped. I don't appreciate that, Kellerman continued. Not in my care, not around my family. He paused. You're a good nurse, I'm sure. But good nurses know their lane. They know who they're dealing with. They know when to ask questions and when to trust that the people above them have things handled. He turned to Dr. Chen. The dismissal was complete and total and performed with the ease of a man who had been dismissing people his entire professional life. I'd like a different nurse for the remainder of my stay, he said. Someone with more experience, more judgment. Dr. Chen nodded. She didn't look at Maya. Maya stood at the bedside for one more second. She was aware of the room. She was aware of the son's eyes on her. Something in them that wasn't quite his father's certainty. Something that looked almost like discomfort. She was aware of the particular silence that follows a public wound. The way it expands to fill every corner of the space, the way everyone in the room becomes a witness and no one becomes an ally. She said, Of course. 2 words. Flat, correct. She set her tablet on the cart. She walked to the door. She did not hurry and she did not slow down, and the rhythm of her steps was exactly what it always was. Measured, deliberate, the walk of someone who knows precisely where they are going. And she moved through the door and into the corridor, and she did not look back. In the corridor, one of the other nurses, Danny, boy 28, 3 years on the ward, was standing near the station. She had heard. Everyone within 30 feet had heard. She looked at Maya with an expression that was equal parts sympathy and warning. The look of someone who has watched this institution long enough to know what a flag officer's displeasure costs. Maya picked up her chart. She made a notation. Her handwriting was small and precise and completely even. You okay? Danny asked quietly. Maya considered the question with the same attention she gave every question. Not performing consideration, actually performing it, actually running the internal assessment before she answered. I'm fine, she said. And she was. That was the thing that would have surprised anyone watching her. The thing that might have made them look twice. Might have made them wonder. She was fine in a way that didn't look like suppression and didn't look like shock. She was fine in the way of someone who has absorbed worse than this and kept moving, who has learned in some context that no one in this corridor could name that the moment after a blow is not the moment to stop. The moment after a blow is the moment to assess, to catalogue, to decide what comes next. She pulled up the incident documentation form on her tablet. She began to type. Her hands were completely steady. Down the corridor, through the glass, she could see the Admiral's room filling with warmth and relief, and the particular light of a family reunited. She could see Kellerman's hand reaching for his son's arm. She could see Dr. Chen smiling. She typed. She documented. She saved the file. Then she opened a second window and began, very quietly, to look up the name of the JAG officer assigned to Naval Medical Center San Diego. The reassignment paperwork arrived on a Tuesday, slipped under the break room door sometime between 3 and 4 in the morning, when the night shift was at its thinnest and no one would have to watch her read it. That was the institutional kindness, the bureaucratic version of looking away while you delivered the blow. Maya found it when she came in for her coffee at 3:47. A single sheet folded in thirds with her name typed across the front in the clean, indifferent font of official documents. She stood in the break room under the fluorescent light that always buzzed slightly off-key and read it twice, then folded it back exactly as it had come and put it in her pocket. Cardiac step down. Effective the following Monday. The language was careful, even generous. Expanded clinical exposure, broadened competency development. The kind of language that meant nothing and everything simultaneously. The kind that would look fine in a personnel file and devastating in context. Anyone who knew the sequence of events would understand. Anyone who didn't would see a routine rotation. That was how it worked. You didn't have to be destroyed loudly. You just had to be moved. She finished her last 3 nights in the ICU without incident, which was its own kind of discipline. She charted with the same precision. She administered medications on schedule. She spoke to the patients in the same measured, unhurried tone she always used, on the tone that said, "I am here, and I am paying attention, and nothing about this moment is beyond management." The other nurses watched her with a mix of sympathy and careful distance, the way people watch someone walking across ice, present, but not willing to share the weight. Dr. Chen did not speak to her directly after the reassignment. That, too, was a kind of message. What Maya did not do, in those final 3 nights, was go anywhere near room 14. She didn't need to. She had already seen what she needed to see, and what she had seen was living now in a different place. Not in the ICU, not in the hospital at all, but in the 47 pages of notes she had compiled over 11 days of night shifts, cross-referenced against the official incident report from the training exercise, the preliminary NCIS summary that had been filed and then quietly amended, and 3 separate first-hand accounts from junior enlisted sailors who had survived the crash and who had spoken to her not because she had sought them out, but because 2 of them were patients in this same hospital, in other wards, and one of them had grabbed her arm in a hallway 3 days after Kellerman's admission and said, with the particular desperation of someone who has been told their memory is incorrect, "Somebody needs to know what actually happened out there." She had listened, she had written it down, she had verified what could be verified. The picture that emerged was not complicated. It was, in fact, by the simplest kind of catastrophe, the kind that comes not from equipment failure or weather, or the 1,000 uncontrollable variables of a combat-adjacent environment, but from a single decision made by a single man who had confused his own certainty with operational reality. Kellerman had pushed the insertion window by 90 minutes against the recommendation of his operations officer. He had done it because the exercise was being observed by a congressional delegation, and he wanted the optics of a night operation, the drama of it, the theater. 23 sailors had died in the water because an admiral wanted to look impressive in the dark. The official report said mechanical failure. The official report had been written by people who worked for Kellerman, reviewed by people who owed Kellerman, and filed by people who understood that the alternative, the true account, would end careers in concentric circles outward from his own. Maya had the names of the sailors. She had memorized them the way she had once memorized grid coordinates, the way certain kinds of knowledge settle into the body rather than just the mind. She did not think of this as unusual. She thought of it as the minimum. On her last night in the ICU, she sat in the break room at 2 a.m. and opened her laptop and wrote an email. It was 3 paragraphs long. It contained no accusations, no emotional language, no requests. It contained a summary of documented inconsistencies, a list of attached files, and a single sentence at the end that said, "I believe this warrants review under Article 92 and potentially Article 119. Yet I am available to speak further at your convenience." She sent it to a JAG officer named Lieutenant Commander Patricia Osei, whom she had never met, whose name she had found through a chain of careful, offline inquiry that had taken her 4 days and left no digital trail worth following. She had chosen Osei for 3 reasons. Her record indicated she had prosecuted 2 previous cases involving senior officer misconduct. She had no documented professional relationship with Kellerman or his command, and she had a reputation, among the people who knew such things, for being genuinely difficult to intimidate. Maya closed the laptop, finished her coffee, and went back to work. She did not hear back for 6 days. In those 6 days, she moved to cardiac step-down, learned the rhythms of a new unit, and said nothing to anyone about anything. She was polite, she was competent, she was, to all observable evidence, a nurse who had been rotated to a new assignment and was getting on with it. The charge nurse in step-down was a retired Navy corpsman named Delgado, who had the particular gift of not asking questions he didn't want answered, and he and Maya developed an immediate and wordless professional respect. On the 4th day, she heard through the hospital's informal information network, the one that operated entirely through tone of voice and significant pauses in hallway conversations, that Admiral Kellerman had been moved out of the ICU and into a private recovery suite on the 3rd floor, that he was receiving visitors, that his prognosis was excellent, that the Navy's Public Affairs Office had released a statement praising his resilience and thanking the staff of Naval Medical Center San Diego for their exceptional care. She read the statement once and did not read it again. On the 6th day, Lieutenant Commander Osei called her on her personal cell at 6:14 in the evening. Maya was in the parking garage, sitting in her car before driving home, which was a habit she had developed years ago and had never fully explained to herself. The 10 minutes of stillness between the work and the world, the decompression chamber. "Ms. Reeves," Osei said. Her voice was precise and unhurried. "I've reviewed what you sent." "All right," Maya said. "I have questions. I expected you would." There was a brief pause, not hesitation, more like calibration, and the pause of someone deciding how directly to proceed. "Some of what you've documented is consistent with information we've received through other channels. I want to be careful about what I say on this line, but I want you to understand that you are not the only person who has raised concerns." Maya said nothing. She watched a seagull land on the concrete barrier at the far end of the garage level and immediately lose interest in whatever had drawn it there. "I also want to be direct with you," Osei continued. "The moment this moves forward in any formal way, you will become visible. Admiral Kellerman's legal representation is already active. They've been making inquiries, broad ones. I understand. Do you?" Osei's tone wasn't skeptical. It was careful. "They will look at your record, your background, everything." There was something in the way she said background, a fractional weight, a slight deliberateness, that made Maya go very still. "Let them look," Maya said. Another pause, longer this time. And then Osei said something that was not a question and not a statement, but something in between, something that existed in the register of recognition. The sound a person makes when a piece of information they have been holding in isolation suddenly connects to something larger. "I pulled your file this afternoon," Osei said quietly. "The full file, not the hospital HR record." Maya's hand tightened slightly on the phone. She said nothing. "There's a gap," Osei said. 7 years? The kind of gap that isn't really a gap." The seagull lifted off the barrier and disappeared into the grey above the garage. "Ms. Reeves," Osei said, and her voice had shifted. Not softer, exactly, but differently weighted. The way a conversation shifts when the people in it have stopped performing and started speaking. "I think you know that what you started here is going to get significantly larger before it gets resolved. I think you also know that when it does, the people trying to discredit you are going to find something they are not prepared for." Maya looked at the empty space where the seagull had been. I think, Osei said, that you should be prepared for that moment, and I think you should let it happen exactly the way it's going to happen. She didn't explain what she meant. She didn't need to. There was a quality to the silence between them that suggested Osei had seen something in that file, something redacted, something classified, something that existed in the category of records that don't appear in standard searches, and had understood it in the way that certain people understand certain things, not with surprise, but with a kind of arriving clarity, the feeling of a shape finally becoming visible. "I'll be in touch," Osei said. "Stay available." The call ended. Maya sat in the parking garage for another 4 minutes. She thought about the 23 names she had memorized. She thought about the reassignment paperwork still folded in her jacket pocket. She thought about Admiral Kellerman in his private recovery suite on the 3rd floor, receiving visitors, being praised for his resilience, performing his survival for an audience that had no reason to question the performance. He had looked at her in that room and seen a nurse. He had seen someone without rank, without institutional leverage, without the standing to challenge him. He had seen the scrubs and the badge and the clipboard and made the calculation that men like him always make. The calculation that the hierarchy is visible, that power announces itself, that the person who can hurt you will look like someone who can hurt you. He had been wrong about that before. He just didn't know it yet. She started the car and drove home through the San Diego evening, the harbor lights beginning to appear through the salt-gray dusk, and she did not think about what was coming. She had learned, a long time ago in a different life, that thinking about what was coming was a way of spending energy that belonged to the moment of arrival. You prepared, you waited, and when the moment came, you were already there. She had always been good at waiting. The JAG office at Naval Station San Diego occupied a corner of Building 12 that smelled of old coffee and institutional carpet, and it was there, at 6:14 on a Tuesday morning, that Rear Admiral Thomas Voss read the file for the 3rd time. He had read it the first time with skepticism, the second time with something approaching unease. The 3rd time, he set it down on the desk and looked out the window at the grey water of the bay, and did not move for a long while. The file was Maya Reeves's. All of it. The part she had submitted through Lieutenant Commander Farris, the JAG officer who had taken her call 6 days ago and nearly dismissed her before she said 3 words that made him sit back down. And the parts that Farris had pulled himself, once he understood what he was looking at. Service records, deployment logs, commendation citations. A photograph from 2014 that Voss kept returning to, because the woman in it, standing in desert kit, dust on her face, a rifle slung low, looked nothing like the nurse who had been publicly dressed down in a hospital room, and yet was unmistakably the same person. He picked up his phone. He made a call. 40 minutes later, he walked into Naval Medical Center San Diego with 2 JAG officers, a Navy investigator, and the kind of quiet authority that does not announce itself because it does not need to. Kellerman was sitting up in bed when they arrived. He had been sitting up for 3 days now, the miraculous recovery fully performed, the role of wounded hero executed with the same precision he had brought to every other operation of his career. His wife had cried. His son had gripped his hand. Dr. Chen had written a progress note that used the word remarkable twice. The Navy Public Affairs Office had drafted a statement. Everything was proceeding. His legal team had also been proceeding. They had filed the complaint against Maya Reeves with the hospital's nursing board. They had submitted a formal letter to the medical center's commanding officer questioning her clinical judgment, her professional conduct, and her fitness for duty in a high acuity environment. The letter was specific. It cited dates. It cited the names of witnesses. It was the kind of document that ends careers quietly, without drama, without a hearing, because the institution simply stops trusting you and the opportunities stop coming, and eventually you leave. Kellerman had signed it himself. He had done so without hesitation. Because in his experience, the most effective way to neutralize a threat was to discredit it before it could speak. He did not know that the threat had already spoken. He did not know what she had said. He did not know who she was. Voss entered the room first. Behind him, Faris carried a manila folder. The Navy investigator, a compact woman named Chief Petty Officer Daniels, stood near the door and said nothing. Kellerman looked at Voss and his expression shifted through several calculations in the space of a second. He recognized rank. He recognized the JAG insignia. He recognized that this was not a courtesy visit. "Admiral Kellerman," Voss said. "I'm Rear Admiral Thomas Voss, Judge Advocate General's office. We need to speak with you about the events of March 14th. My lawyers have been notified. They're on their way." Voss pulled a chair to the bedside and sat down with the unhurried ease of a man who has already won the argument and is simply waiting for the other person to understand that. "In the meantime, I'd like to discuss a witness statement we received and some additional documentation." Kellerman's jaw tightened. What witness? Voss opened the folder. He did not answer immediately. He placed a single page on the bedside tray. The timeline. Maya's timeline. 14 days of documented observations, cross-referenced with the neurological charts, the crash data, the testimony from 3 junior sailors who had been told their statements were not needed and had given them anyway, to a JAG officer who had driven to their barracks at night and asked them to tell the truth. Kellerman looked at the page. His face did not change, but something behind his eyes did. "This was compiled by a nurse," Voss said. "Night shift ICU. She flagged the neurological inconsistencies on day 2. She documented your responses to stimuli across 11 separate observation windows. She cross-referenced the crash timeline with the official report and identified 4 specific discrepancies." He paused. "She also obtained testimony from Petty Officers Ruiz, Nakamura, and Walsh, all of whom were present during the pre-insertion briefing on March 14th, and all of whom confirmed that the go order came from you, Admiral, against the recommendation of your mission commander." The room was very quiet. 23 men, Voss said, not as an accusation, as a fact, the way you say a number when the number is the whole argument. Kellerman said, I want my lawyers." "They're coming." Voss closed the folder. "But before they arrive, I want you to understand something about the nurse who built this case." He looked at Kellerman steadily. "Because I think you've made some assumptions about her, and I think those assumptions were a mistake." He nodded to Faris, who placed a second document on the tray. It was a service record. Kellerman looked at it the way you look at something that doesn't immediately resolve into meaning, and then the meaning arrived, and his face went very still. The name at the top was Maya Reeves, but the record beneath it was not the record of a nurse. It was the record of a Naval Special Warfare Support Operator, attached to DevGru from 2011 to 2019. 8 deployments, 3 combat theaters, but a Silver Star citation from 2015 for actions in a location that was still classified. A call sign printed in the operational logs with the matter-of-fact bluntness of military record-keeping. Cardinal. Kellerman read the word and stopped breathing for a moment, because he knew that call sign. Every senior officer in Naval Special Warfare knew that call sign, or had known it, in the years when it was active. Cardinal was the operator who had pulled 2 SEAL Team 6 members out of a collapsed structure in Mosul in 2015 under direct fire, who had held a breach point alone for 11 minutes while the extraction team reorganized, who had been written up for the Silver Star by a task force commander who said in the citation that her situational awareness and tactical discipline were, without qualification, and the finest he had witnessed in 20 years of special operations. She had left the service in 2019. Medical separation. The details were sealed. She had become a nurse. She had been watching him for 14 days, and he had stood over her in a hospital room, in front of her colleagues and his family and her attending physician, and told her she lacked experience, that she lacked judgment, that she lacked respect for hierarchy. He had told Cardinal that she didn't know enough to question him. Voss watched Kellerman's face complete its journey from certainty to comprehension, to something that had no clean name, not quite shame, not quite fear, but the specific devastation of a man who has just understood that the person he publicly destroyed was more decorated, more tested, and more credible than he will ever be able to claim again. She didn't tell anyone, Voss said quietly. She didn't use it. She built the case on the medicine and the evidence and the testimony, because that's what she was trained to do. She let the work speak. He stood. But I'm speaking for it now. The door opened. Kellerman's lawyers entered. Behind them, visible for just a moment in the hallway before the door swung shut, stood Maya Reeves in her scrubs, her hands at her sides, her face composed and unreadable. She did not look like a woman waiting for an apology. She looked like a woman who had already won and simply wanted to make sure the work was finished. Voss turned back to Kellerman one last time. 23 men, Admiral, he said again. Their families have been waiting for the truth since March 14th. I think they've waited long enough. He opened his folder and began. The room where Admiral James Kellerman received his formal notification was not a courtroom. It was a conference room on the 4th floor of Naval Medical Center San Diego, the same building where he had spent 11 days pretending to be unconscious, where he had summoned a nurse to his bedside and publicly dismantled her in front of her colleagues, where he had believed, with the absolute certainty of a man who had never been seriously questioned, that his rank was a kind of permanent weather system under which lesser people simply had to live. The room had a window. Through it, you could see the flight deck of a carrier in the harbor, grey and enormous, indifferent to everything happening above it. Kellerman sat at the table in civilian clothes, not dress whites, and not the uniform with the ribbons that told the story of 31 years in the United States Navy. Civilian clothes, because his counsel had advised it, because the uniform at this point was no longer armor, it was evidence. Maya Reeves was not in that room. She had not asked to be. She was on the floor below, finishing a 12-hour shift, checking the medication chart of a 22-year-old seaman who had come through appendix surgery and was already trying to negotiate his way back to solid food. She was doing her job, the job she had chosen, the job she had worn like a second skin for 3 years, while the first skin, the one with the rank, the call sign, the clearances that still technically existed in a database somewhere in a building in Virginia, waited in the dark like something she had decided not to need anymore. She had been wrong about that. She had needed it exactly once, and it had been enough. What the JAG investigation ultimately produced was not a single dramatic document, but a cascade of them. Testimony from 11 junior sailors, flight data from the recovered black box, a communication log that showed Kellerman had been warned twice about weather conditions and visibility over the insertion zone, and had overridden both warnings with a single typed response that read simply, "Proceed as planned." 23 men, his call, his pride, his absolute institutional certainty that the men under his command existed to execute his judgment, not to survive it. The stage coma had bought him time. That was all it had ever been designed to do. Create a window in which the official report could be finalized, the narrative could be sealed, and the Admiral could emerge from his hospital bed as a survivor rather than a defendant. It had been a calculated performance, and it had nearly worked. Would have worked, if not for a night shift ICU nurse who noticed that his pupils responded differently when he thought no one was looking, who documented the micro-expressions, who kept asking questions after she had been publicly told to stop. The formal charge was conduct unbecoming. There were additional charges. The proceedings were not open to the press, but in the way of all things military, The outline of what happened moved through the community like weather, quietly, everywhere, impossible to stop. Kellerman's son, Lieutenant Daniel Kellerman, submitted a request for reassignment 2 weeks after the investigation became official. He did not make a public statement, or he did not visit his father in the days following the notification. What he did, according to the people who knew him, was sit in his quarters for a long time, and then begin the process of figuring out who he was when the name he carried stopped being a credential and became a weight. That was its own kind of reckoning. Not Maya's to carry, but real. Dr. Sarah Chen submitted a letter of clarification to the hospital's review board. A careful, lawyerly document that stopped just short of an apology and landed somewhere in the territory of I deferred to institutional pressure in ways I would not repeat. Her career did not end, it bent. There is a difference, and Chen would spend years understanding exactly what that difference cost her in the mirror. Maya's reassignment was reversed. Officially, with a written acknowledgement from the hospital's chief of medicine that her clinical observations had been, in his precise bureaucratic phrasing, substantively correct and inappropriately dismissed. She was offered a formal apology. She accepted it without ceremony, folded the paper, and put it in her locker next to nothing, because she kept nothing in her locker. What she did not do was explain herself. She did not hold a press conference. She did not give interviews. She did not allow the story of her previous life, the deployments, the call sign, the years operating in environments that required a particular kind of human being who could read a room the way other people read text, who could assess threat and deception and the specific weight of a lie. To become the headline. The story was not about her. The story was about 23 sailors and the man who had decided their lives were acceptable variables in his personal calculus of pride. She had been asked once, by the JAG officer handling the case, whether she wanted to be present for the formal proceedings. She had thought about it for a moment, genuinely thought about it, the way she thought about everything, with the full weight of her attention, and then she had said no. She had already been present for the part that mattered. The part that mattered had happened in a hospital corridor, 3 days after she had been reassigned, when a SEAL admiral with a fleet of institutional protection behind him had looked at her across a room full of people and understood, in the space of a single breath, that he had made a catastrophic error in judgment about who she was. She had watched it happen in his face. The recognition, the recalculation, the dawning and terrible understanding that the woman he had publicly humiliated as inexperienced, as lacking judgment, as unqualified to question a senior physician's assessment, had forgotten more about reading human deception than he had ever known. That she had operated in theaters he had only briefed. That her instincts were not the anxious overcaution of a rookie nurse, but the precise, field-tested instruments of someone who had spent years in environments where being wrong meant people died. He had known, in that moment, that she had him. Not because of rank, not because of the call sign, though the call sign was what had cracked him open. Because she had been right. She had been right from the first night, and she had kept being right while he used every institutional lever available to him to make her stop. There is a specific kind of defeat that lives in that recognition. Maya had not enjoyed it. That surprised her, a little. She had expected something cleaner, some bright, hard satisfaction. What she felt instead was tired and clear. The way you feel after something long and difficult is finally, irrevocably finished. She finished her shift. She drove home along the coast road with the window down. The Pacific dark and enormous to her left, the city lights scattered across the hills to her right. She did not think about Kellerman. She thought about the 23 sailors, as she had thought about them every day since she had first read the crash report in the break room at 2 a.m. with cold coffee and the specific, in-focused fury of someone who recognizes a lie that has been dressed up as a tragedy. She thought about them the way she always would. Not with grief exactly. With the particular, permanent attention of someone who had decided that their names deserved at least one person who refused to look away. She had been that person. It had cost her something. It had restored something older and heavier and more essential. She drove home. She slept. In the morning, she went back to work.